Hello all, I hope you're doing well. I found myself contemplating earlier why the left seems to hold Islam in such a sacred space. I know I'm not the first person to ask this question, but as I started to work it through, I thought it might be worth putting some thoughts down on video, and hopefully I can offer a novel perspective that someone out there might find interesting. It is one of the absurdities of modernity when we look at it from the top, because on the surface this makes no sense at all. I mean, to break both sides down, Islam, famously focused on Allah as a religious movement, it's highly socially conservative. It has traditional gender roles to an extreme level, even to the point of women completely covering themselves up in public. It has firm, if not brutal, lines on LGBTQ identities and so on. And it's really got a very strong warrior energy. This has been spoken about by many right-wing figures throughout the years. Evola, I think, spoke about it. Nietzsche too, if you can call him right-wing. I guess he's meta-political. But the left is the polar opposite of this, of course. It's secular in its nature, famously battled with Christianity, seeing that as an oppressive structure, full of fairy stories and nonsense as we come in to the great enlightened liberal utopia. On top of that, when we compare it to Islam, it's very much against gender roles. Famously, the left is feminist. It believes gender roles are social constructions that need to be deconstructed to again create some form of liberation. It's inherently pro-LGBTQ. Again, it would view sexual norms as another form of oppression. And the left, broadly speaking, is more anti-warrior. It would see a warrior energy as really a vestige of toxic masculinity, another thing which needs to be destroyed, another, quote, construct, in their view, which has to be taken down. And what's even stranger is, as a Christian myself, I've often looked at Islam and thought, well, you know what, there are lots of crossover here and there with Christianity and Islam, with regards to social conservatism and so on. And in many ways, we're more similar to Islam than we are to liberalism. We're just a more peaceful version, really. But the left hate Christianity like nothing else. Now, you could say they don't hate Christianity if it's the new Christianity, which is remade in the image of liberalism. I mean, just need to look at the Anglican Church to see how that's going. Turns into basically gay churches and the rest of it. You've all seen that. But this doesn't really make any sense, this whole thing, until you inject the key ingredient, which is, of course, race. And we have to remember the liberal leftist conception of reality these days really is rooted in critical theory conceptions. Now, through that lens, race is nothing more than a cultural construct created to wield unjust power. Of course, white Western man is ultimately guilty of that, and creating or supposedly creating these racialist categories with which he can lord it over the rest of the world. And all of the issues that we still see in different parts of the world ultimately go back to white Western man. That's why he's the ultimate enemy. This too plays into lots of the liberalist conceptions post-Second World War. Explored it before on the channel. Hitler is the secular Satan of the era. I've tried to really explore on this channel how you can't really remove mythology from man. You can read all the Richard Dawkins you like, but you'll still formulate a mythology of how the world works, just like man will always find a reason to rhyme, whether it's musically, poetically, or even just our sayings about life. We will always rhyme and will always find mythology. That's because it speaks to a deeper, more non-rational part of ourselves, the artistic, the soulful. So when we put all of this together, what we can see then is that we're actually, or the leftist liberal, and by extension, mainstream society, is living in a new moral theology. It's sort of post-religious or post-traditional in a sense. And through this lens, the ultimate moral good doesn't mean being sort of post-racial or even neutral. It means that you must not be the secular Satan. You can't have any opinions which are counter to liberalism. So to be good, to show yourself as good, you must be actively anti-racist. And I think this goes back to that famous quote by the African-American woman, Angela Davis, I think she was called. Something like, in a racist society, it's never enough to be non-racist. You must be anti-racist or anti-racist, as our American friends say. But the point I'm making here, this really is the line of a secular saint of liberal modernity. It's not just being neutral, it's not just seeing race, it's not just treating people equally. You must be actively bought in, paid into the very system which views our history through the lens of critical theory. Now, through this lens again, we have to see there are spiritual structures at play. Now, they're not really spiritual, they're counterfeit. But we could say this view of universalism amongst all people, this blank slatism, the core of liberalism, really is a counterfeit version of spiritual enlightenment. The idea is that you sort of moved beyond worldly categories. You can see through it. But of course the heathens can't. They're too ignorant and stupid, lost in their ego, racist and the rest of it. But you, by seeing through this, can embrace true reality. You've gone beyond. And it's ironic because when you understand this stuff, you realise that's just another ego position. It's no different from the spiritualist who thinks that they're enlightened and they're better than everyone else. But you've probably seen these people. They're almost the most egoic people you can come across. But it's the same as that, just in an ideological context. And through this, we can understand the core theme of liberal modernity and the supposed ethics that go with it. And that's the idea of the other. We sometimes hear about this, you're othering that group, And of course, what the other means is that by othering, you are marginalising, excluding, dehumanising someone from another group, because again, you're trapped in this limited understanding of reality because you're not enlightened, you haven't overcome yourself to a certain degree. Now, this is extremely powerful, especially when you're young. If you're a bit older, you probably didn't buy into this, maybe you were inoculated against it, but the real reason it's so powerful is you can always find examples of one group othering another. Human beings are tribal, so it's easy to find examples of this. And of course, it's easy, even from a neutral frame, to say, it's really cruel if you're being needlessly horrible to somebody. But the point is, this ideology can take examples of cruelty and use them as, if you like, a universal message of the ill of being tribal or recognising the differences between groups. And it sort of poisons the well of the recognition of one's own group compared to another. That becomes othering no matter whether it's morally right or wrong. The next point is, it's very easy to adopt this ideology of othering. I experienced this when I was young in university. You get hammered by it. And I know many of you who are a bit older think, how can you be so stupid? When you grow up without a tradition, when you don't know who you are, when you have no father figures, no elders, no religion, no national identity, you're basically an empty vessel. And then when you're getting hammered constantly by the media, by music, by education, it's easy to take on these ideas. And all your authority figures are telling you to believe this. It can be very intoxicating. And why it's even more intoxicating is it really does play to the ego. Because at the root of lots of these leftist liberal ideologies, it's not complicated at all. They love the flowery language if you read, the critical theorists. And even the Guardianistas, they love a good old... I remember when I started to come out of this stuff, I call it a bit of mental masturbation, They have a bit of an intellectual wank. And they love to, riff on all of these wonderful phrases and everything's problematic and complex and managerial language. And it makes you feel really smart. But at the root of things, it's really just a trick of language. Like Orwell said, if you're going to explain something, explain it simply. Because the real difficulty in life is grasping the more difficult concepts and seeing how things play out over time in broader narrative structures. The modern leftist liberal ideology does not demand that. It just says, wipe it all away. White Western man is always immoral. That's the cause of everything. And if you're othering, you're bad. And then they create all this vast flowery garden of language to cover up this basic truth. But once you understand that, you can be seen as hyper smart, hyper intellectual, get your fancy degrees, and be a radical. It's sort of, ironically, this sort of corporate packaged rebellion. Which isn't really rebelling, you're in service of the system, as I've explored many times. But the point is, it's intoxicating, especially if you're young, especially if you're a bit of a midwit. It's probably why it took me a long time to work through this. I readily accept I'm not the most intelligent person in the world, but once I got out through the university system, I had to start thinking about this deeply for myself. And then you realise, it's actually really simple. They're just dressing it up. But it's intoxicating to the ego, especially in an era where people are uncertain of who they are. where poisonous ideologies come in when you remove the defence of tradition. Now again, I think perhaps the major reason why it's so powerful is man needs spiritual sustenance. Again, you can read all the Dawkins you like, but man will always seek that out, whether it's walking in the mountains and being blown away by the incredible beauty of nature. Remember, beauty is non-rational. You don't have a choice. If you face a mountain, it overtakes you. You can't help but admire, and just look in awe. Maybe it's just a second that it overtakes you, but something washes through you that speaks to the rhythm of the soul rather than the noise and the bias of the mind. So the point I'm making here is modern man has been cut off from the experiences of beauty, especially in our divine traditions and national expressions. They're all seen as evil, so they all have to go. And what this worldview offers is a sort of counterfeit source of meaning, morality, and even transcendence. And this is why the word racism has such power in this day and age. You're a racist. That's a classic word spell of the era. You're almost under its spell and everybody suspects you immediately, at least in the mainstream. And I'm sure many of us would probably see through it quite quickly now. We've been inoculated. We built Jedi powers to defend ourselves through years of them hammering us with it. But the point is that it has such strength because it's a counterfeit sacredness. You're undermining the universality of humanity. You're stepping into pure evil, pure unenlightened evil. And that's what the word really means. But remember, it's a counterfeit morality. That's not me promoting being cruel to other groups. It's recognizing how liberal modernity has used that and usurped it to essentially dominate the cultural and political narrative of the age. So what does this mean? If you are someone lost in modernity, well, it means that you must be pro the other. You prove your morality, you virtue signal your reality by being pro the other rather than anti. And remember, when you're pro the other, it's not actually about the other. For instance, I've said before, I'm into comparative mythology and all sorts of spiritual themes, and I can happily talk with the leftists of London at some meditation meetup about all sorts of things. But if I mention something like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, famous Qawwali singer, very good actually, leftists won't even know what you're talking about. But if they knew my views, they'd accuse me of othering other people because they think that's the moral thing to do. But I can see with them, they don't actually have any interest in the deeper aspects of Islam and Sufism and its art. They wouldn't even know what you're talking about. Again, I'm sure there are examples who do, but they're a massive minority. The point is, someone like me, who's a supposed, bigot, evil Westerner, would take more of an interest in elements of Islam than they would, because it's not actually about Islam. It's about them. And once we understand this, we see that it's really the idea of including or being inclusive is to express one's own moral greatness, if you like. And in fact, the worse the other, quote, behaves, the better for the modern liberal. And this is why Islam fits so perfectly. Because let's be honest, Islam is not an easy one to deal with in the Western world, is it? I mean, they're aggressive, they're highly, they have a high in-group preference. They look like that slowly, they're starting to grip into institutions. And I haven't even touched on yet the difficulties of people living around them, as well as the obvious terrorism and the grooming gangs. Now, if you're looking at this neutrally, you think, oh yeah, that's a problem. That's a big problem in the Western world. I'm not saying all Muslims are bad. I've met plenty of good ones. I've even seen elements of their faith which I find intriguing, and there's crossover between my own spiritual experience. But broadly speaking, on a cultural context, on a meta context, it's not good news for the Western world. It's just not. And this is why Christianity and Islam have been at loggerheads throughout history. It's only the blindness of Blairism that makes us think we're all going to get on great now because we've got money and pride parades. Yeah, let's get to the end. It's not going to work. Spoiler alert. It's going to create problems. But the point is, to the liberal leftist who's lost in the trap of modern ideology, to them, the worse Islam behaves, the better. Because it's a way that they can exhibit their virtue all the more, which again is a counterfeit version of real spirituality, which would be something like the Christian depth of forgiveness, which is hard for us humans to even understand the depth of forgiveness and what that truly means. I should just say as a side note here, if you are secular and you're thinking forgiveness just means allow people to do awful things, that's not what it means. It means to rid your heart of poison so you can act justly in the world. Worldly punishment may still be called for in given situations. The point is so you're not taken over by that hatred and anger for the rest of your life. Let's say someone murders one of your family members. Yeah, okay, it's understandable you're going to be deeply angry and by all means seek worldly justice. But the point is that you don't get eaten alive by that for the rest of your life. There comes a time where you can let go of it and be free because you shouldn't be under the oppression of that person who did that to you. That's the point. Anyway, on a side note there. The issue that I'm making here is that we have to understand this is why Islam has this sacred place. It's because we don't have a tradition, and for the leftists, it's a way to express who they think they really are in their new identity, their new moral theology. And they don't really have to deal with Muslims in the real life or the issues that come from Islam, other than a trip to the odd curry house to talk about how wonderful food is, with our diverse culture. But again, it's not about embracing Islam, really. It's about keeping the counterfeit identity moving. And this is why they actively, paradoxically enough, need you to other the other. They want you. They need a supply of racism because it keeps their identity going. Because it lets them stand up and say, I'm the big, brave, moral one that will stand up to the othering of these far-right racists. It makes them feel good about themselves. And this is why, in recent decades, everything's become racist. Because they've run out of examples to say, that person's being racist and isn't that person terrible? Because most people are actually just decent people. Yeah, some people might be edgy, some people not. But broadly speaking, people aren't just evil. We're more complex than that. So they have to create new forms of racism, Islamophobia, and what do they call them? That one where you... unconscious bias, that's it, where you don't even know you're doing anything. They constantly create these new forms. Microaggressions. So you seem racist because they need that fuel to sustain their identity. The only problem is that it's just built on a castle of sand. And as things get worse, as the reality of Islam is revealed and the flimsiness of the liberal ideology is revealed, as well as how it's basically just a false counterfeit spirituality or tradition, religious tradition for modernity, people will be deeply lost and they won't know how to deal with it, because they'll be snapped back into reality. Now, this is a hard one for many to take, and I understand it's not easy, but I think this is why we need people who are deeply embedded in their own tradition, because these are our people that have got lost in brainwashing, really, is what's happened. Really what they're yearning is sustenance for their soul, and they've been lied to. They think they're being hyper-moral. They think that they're leading to a better tomorrow. What they're really doing is destroying the West, destroying themselves. And this is why I believe we do need to have that step beyond the worldly formation in our own understanding, the real spiritual understanding, because we can then turn to these people like the father turns to the prodigal son and say, it's all right, like you got lost, come home, And people will come home if we don't try and prove them wrong and say, aren't you stupid, and all this sort of thing, and aren't I bright and clever? That's our own ego position to try and deal with. But it's only when we do this, people will come home to the trad, and we will be able to actually counter this. The West will galvanise. We say to lots of people, you've been lost in a daydream, but don't worry, we're waking up. And we wake up not in hatred, we wake up in truth and justice, and we go forward in that line. It's that will, in my view, bring the West forward once more. Anyhow, just some thoughts off the top of my head. Do let me know what you think down below about this. And if you're new, do consider subscribing to the channel. On a side note, I do have a spiritual channel about personal and spiritual transformation called The Sacred Way. Check that out down below and enjoy the rest of your day.